Imagine losing your job for criticizing a foreign power. Well, that's what just happened to David Miller, a sociologist and former professor at the University of Bristol, recently sacked from the university because of remarks he made criticizing Israel. Despite being cleared of any wrongdoing or racism by an independent lawyer's report, the university decided to fire him anyway, following an endless barrage of manufactured hysteria and defamatory comments accusing Miller of anti-Semitism. This comes almost 1 year exactly after former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn was suspended from the Labour Party, the victim of a similar smear campaign. So how is it exactly that a professor in the United Kingdom can get fired for criticizing the crimes of a foreign power? Would Professor Miller have been fired if he made the same remarks about Saudi Arabia? Exactly how much influence do Israeli lobby groups have in Britain that they can essentially pick and choose who's allowed to run in British politics and teach in British academia? I'm Richard Medhurst, and you're watching The Communique. Just like in America, when you see Joe Biden or Kamala Harris sending billions of dollars to Israel, professing to be proud Zionists, and giving speeches at AIPAC conferences, Israel's lobby in the US. The same is true of the United Kingdom. After all, who helped create Israel? Who was occupying Palestine for close to 20 years and then issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917, saying that a Jewish homeland would be created there? The United Kingdom. The UK has been one of Zionism's greatest allies since the beginning. So this should come as little surprise to anyone who knows their history. And very much like the United States of America, both major political parties in Britain are indistinguishable in their fealty towards Israel. In Britain, a group exists called the Conservative Friends of Israel. As the name implies, it consists of conservative members of parliament who sympathize with Israel and the Zionist cause. Just take a guess how many members of the Conservative Party belong to this group. 80%. Yes, 80%. So in other words, an overwhelming majority of Tory MPs proudly consider themselves pals of Israel and all its practices. I wonder if they also have an organization called Conservative Friends of Palestine, although I doubt you'll be seeing one of those anytime soon. Now, this seemingly amicable relation between British MPs and Israel is neither confined to just extracurricular activities, nor merely symbolic. Indeed, it translates into real political decisions. In early 2021, the International Criminal Court, or ICC, ruled that it could exercise jurisdiction over Palestine, and therefore investigate Israel for war crimes committed against Palestinians, something that we covered here on the program. Such is the importance of the CFI, that Prime Minister Boris Johnson wrote the group a letter reassuring them that he disagreed with the ICC and did not think that Israel should be investigated. In essence, shielding Israel from the bad PR of its war crimes and crimes against humanity. Sir Alan Duncan revealed Israeli influence and the Conservative Friends of Israel to be the real reason he was blocked from becoming the Minister for the Middle East and North Africa. He perhaps put it best when he said that, quote, "A lot of things do not happen in foreign policy or in government for fear of offending them, because that's the way it's put to them by the CFI, and that the CFI injected a, quote, Netanyahu-type view of Israeli politics into our foreign policy." And if you're thinking, well, maybe the situation is a bit better in the Labour Party, well, you're completely wrong. In such a political climate, it is practically impossible to criticize Israel or to stand up for Palestinians and keep your career. Anyone who does so is cast out and vilified, just like what happened to Jeremy Corbyn or Chris Williamson in 2019 and 2020. The entire smear campaign against them, which we also covered on this program. The MP and former Labour leader of the British Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, was viciously branded a racist and an anti-Semite by the media. He was even accused of fostering a culture of anti-Semitism within Labour's ranks, before finally being suspended from the party in late 2020 for saying that the issue of anti-Semitism in Labour had been dramatically overstated for political reasons, which is true. While he agreed that some MPs had acted wrongly, Corbyn disagreed with the overall premise that the entire party was anti-Semitic, and anything other than full acceptance of the blame assigned to him was considered heresy. After Corbyn's suspension, the Labour Party, now headed by Keir Starmer, a self-proclaimed Zionist without qualification, ushered in a set of reforms with the aim of combating anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, which undoubtedly sounds like a noble endeavour until you realize that their idea of anti-Semitism includes virtually every criticism of Zionism, Israel, and Israeli crimes. It's almost 1 year exactly that Jeremy Corbyn was suspended from the Labour Party, following a grueling, relentless campaign by the British establishment media and pro-Israel groups to character assassinate him, destroy his political career, and sabotage any hopes of a socialist, anti-imperialist reform of Labour's agenda. All this stemming from his support for the Palestinian cause and his criticism of Israel. Back then, many people warned of the dangers this precedent would set. It became clear the Israeli lobby was not going to stop there. Their success in destroying Corbyn would make them feel emboldened to go do the same, go after other critics of Israel, which has now undoubtedly proven to be true. On October 1st, the University of Bristol released a statement revealing that sociologist David Miller would no longer be teaching there, despite the university's admission that Miller's comments did not constitute unlawful speech. In all vagueness, they said that Miller, quote, didn't meet the standards of behavior they expect from faculty. This undoubtedly refers to remarks Miller had made in the past critical of Israel and Zionism. He, much like Jeremy Corbyn, had now been dubbed an anti-Semite and cast out from his place of work for criticizing Israel. To understand the political witch hunt against Professor Miller, we have to go back to 2019. A professor of political sociology, Miller was appointed to teach at the University of Bristol in 2018. He also co-founded and co-directs a non-profit organization called Public Interest Investigations that runs two key projects. One, the research wiki, powerbased.info, and two, Spinwatch, which investigates how the PR industry and corporate and government propaganda influence public debate and democracy. After being appointed to teach at Bristol University in 2018, the following year, in February 2019, Professor Miller tells me that the smear campaign against him began then, with his discussion about the 5 pillars of Islamophobia. The first and foremost being the state and counter-terrorist apparatus in the UK and other countries. He goes on to say that the 4 other pillars of Islamophobia are social movements from above, one of which includes parts of the Zionist movement. Professor Miller explains.
There are 5 pillars to Islamophobia. First, of course, being the state counter-terrorism apparatus, which is the key engine of anti-Muslim discrimination in the UK and in other countries. And that there are 4 other pillars of Islamophobia, which we refer to as social movements from above, that is, powerful social movements, one of which we say is parts of the Zionist movement. And it was that which got me into trouble in the first place.
Complaints against Professor Miller began flooding in from various figures. People who weren't even students at the University of Bristol. People who were students, but not taking his courses. Even organizations outside Bristol University, calling Miller an anti-Semite, calling him a racist, and calling for him to be dismissed. 2 students anonymously complained to the Community Service Trust, or CST. Bristol University rejected this complaint because it wasn't even made by any students at the university and had come from a third party. Reportedly, the CST then encouraged the Union of Jewish Students, or UJS, to write a letter against Miller. The president of the UJS then encouraged the president of the Bristol Jewish Society, a close affiliate of theirs, to sign the letter. This complaint was accepted because the 2 individuals were students at the University of Bristol, but they weren't actually students of Professor Miller's and were taking different classes. As a matter of fact, they hadn't even attended the lectures that they were complaining about or spoken about them to those who did. Despite accepting the complaint at first and following an appeals process, ultimately, the university rejected it, finding no evidence of anti-Semitism, as Miller had only been speaking about Israel, Israel's crimes, and the crimes of the Zionist movement. Despite the fact Professor Miller had been exonerated by the university, pro-Israel groups didn't stop there. Instead, they renewed their efforts, launching a concerted smear campaign against him to try and get him fired.
All the way through this process from early 2019, there's been a kind of manufactured campaign of hysteria about my alleged anti-Semitism, entirely false, defamatory allegations of anti-Semitism, which has been drummed up and reproduced by starting with the CST and then with the UGS and the Bristol JSOC, but also then subsequently a whole host of pro-Israel organisations, probably more pro-Israel organisations than most people know exist in the country. That is carried all the way through since 2019. Eventually that complaint, when it was appealed, I'm cutting a lot out here, was rejected, comprehensively, entirely rejected.
Bristol University decided to hire a lawyer to look into the complaints made against Miller. Professor Miller tells me that according to this very lawyer hired by the university, the lawyer found the complaint against him to be, quote, entirely without merit. This is further corroborated by a leaked document published in Electronic Intifada, confirming no wrongdoing on Miller's part, that there was simply, quote, no case to answer against Professor Miller.
The complaint that was originally made, the only element of it which was relevant, i.e. which related to my conduct at the University of Bristol, was said to be entirely without merit. And so that was a process which resulted in a QC's report reporting in December 2020, entirely exonerating me.
Despite the first complaint being rejected outright and the second one failing as well, in addition to a lawyer's report exonerating Miller, the affair didn't stop there. Although the attempts so far to get Professor Miller fired from Bristol University had failed, this wasn't the end of the saga, nor the witch hunt against him. The most recent wave of manufactured hysteria against Professor Miller came about following an online Zoom meeting he participated in support of Jeremy Corbyn. This was neither a class, nor a lecture, nor any sort of teaching event. The meeting took place on a Saturday, outside work hours, with no affiliation to Bristol University. But it seems this was just the opportunity that Professor Miller's detractors had been waiting for to renew their attacks against him.
When I participated in a Labour Against the Witch Hunt, Labour Campaign for Free Speech Zoom meeting on a Saturday afternoon outside of work, a political meeting, and I referred to the fact that the head of the JSOC and the head of the UGS had, and the words I used were, attacked and complained about me. I didn't say that the complaint was entirely without merit or rubbish and a fabricated complaint about anti-Semitism, which it was.
Professor Miller also began responding directly in the press to the smears made against him, to statements calling him an anti-Semite or containing other defamatory remarks from student unions such as the Union of Jewish Students or Bristol JSOC. And that is when they turned up the heat against him, adding even more pressure and increasing calls for Miller to be removed from his teaching position at the University of Bristol. He says that his latest responses, where he tried to defend himself while also refusing to back down from his criticisms of Zionism, are what ultimately resulted in his termination.
Statements, which, of course, all of which contained defamatory lies about me, calling me an anti-Semite, etc., calling for me to be sacked. And I issued robust responses to those. And then lastly, I wrote an article for the Electronic Intifada in the middle of February. And it was those statements which have eventually got me sacked, because even more high dudgeon was emanated from a whole series of different pro-Israel organisations, including the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Anti-Semitism, which is, some of you will no doubt know, but many of you probably won't, is funded by and always has been, by Zionist funders linked to the State of Israel. As well, they corralled together more than 100 parliamentarians to condemn me and call for me to be sacked, etc. And there were many other calls from pro-Israel groups.
The university's own statement says that the independent report by the lawyer they hired found that Professor Miller's comments did not constitute unlawful speech, which means that Miller's conduct did not breach the Equality Act of 2010, and therefore his comments were lawful and not anti-Semitic. However, Professor Miller says he would have liked the university to make that clearer. But ultimately, even though the lawyer found the complaint against Miller to be without merit, even though there was no misconduct on Miller's part, and his comments found not to be unlawful, meaning they were not anti-Semitic, he was fired anyway by Bristol University.
There was no formal complaint from any student, as should be required by their processes, but nevertheless the university decided to have an investigation. They investigated me. Part of the investigation involved a QC. The university have admitted that the QC found that none of my comments were unlawful, but they didn't go so far as to say that none of my comments were anti-Semitic, which is actually what the QC found. And again, that's in itself a problematic way to describe what happened. And so I was found again for the second time that none of my comments had been in the least bit anti-Semitic. And nevertheless, the university has sacked me because of somehow the tone of my comments was not appropriate, and my comments had upset what they call Jewish students, by which they mean the key pro-Israel leaders of the JSOC at the University of Bristol, the executive, in fact, more senior than that of the JSOC. So I had upset these students by referring to Zionism and calling for the end of Zionism.
Among the groups launching attacks against Miller, dubbing him an anti-Semite and calling for his termination, are student bodies and charities claiming to exclusively represent British Jews, but at the same time, these groups apparently have strong ties to Israel, a foreign power. The Community Service Trust, or CST, the charity which filed the initial complaint against Miller, is a group that fights anti-Semitism in the UK. However, Electronic Intifada reports that in addition, the CST received training from the Mossad, Israel's intelligence service, and also acts as a front for Israel. The Union of Jewish Students, or UJS, which filed the second complaint against Miller, was reported by Al Jazeera to receive funding from the Israeli mission to the UK in the infamous documentary The Lobby, which goes undercover to investigate the Israeli lobby. So the question here is, Professor Miller, are we talking about strictly Jewish groups or Israeli groups, groups with ties to Israel? Because I feel there is an important distinction to be made there, isn't there?
Sure, and this, of course, was part of the problem, was that I had said, look, the Union of Jewish Students, which oversees all Jewish student societies in the UK, is explicitly Zionist in its constitution. It's deeply, deeply embedded in Zionist activism, and this is not a secret. They make statements all the time that they're Zionists, and of course, the Union of Jewish Students is itself formally a member of the World Union of Jewish Students, such that it has a seat by right on the executive of the World Union of Jewish Students, which is based, of course, in Jerusalem. And the World Union of Jewish Students, in turn, of course, is a member of the World Zionist Organization, and as such has the right to send delegates to vote for delegates, etc., at the Zionist Congress, the highest body of the Zionist movement. And I think, these are all matters of fact, but these are matters of fact which many people are not aware of. And when you say these facts, many people can get shocked and say, well, you're accusing Jews of Jew loyalty. You say that they're more loyal to Israel. And I say, well, no, I'm not talking about Jews as a class or Jewish students as a class. I'm talking about these specific Zionist organizations which have specific commitments in their own constitutions. So I didn't make this up. That's their constitutions in their words, which you can see on all of their websites.
When you call for the end of Zionism, could you perhaps explain what that means? What Zionism is? Because once again, I feel there are a lot of people who conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and those are not the same thing, are they?
Zionism is a political ideology, but Zionism has to have that sense of anti-Palestinian, indeed anti-Arab racism at its core. And of course, that's not something which has just happened in 1948 or 1967. It continues today, as everyone in the world saw this in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan and other places where ethnic cleansing continues to this day, because Zionism has to be a racist ideology. Because it has to have a set of views which require and justify the expulsion and the removal of the Palestinians, so that there can never be a meaningful Palestinian state. The eradication, and they use that word, and the dismantling of racism. Now, this is what we're talking about. We have to talk about dismantling this ideology. That doesn't mean we eradicate and dismantle individuals, or of course we're talking about the ideology and the conditions which give rise to that ideology, which is, of course, political processes. And to do that, that of course will involve debate.
We'll be right back after this short break. Just recently, Irish author Sally Rooney also fell victim to an Israeli lobby smear campaign. Having just released her new book, Beautiful World, Where Are You?, an Israeli company offered to translate the book into Hebrew, but she declined. She refused to sell them translation rights to her novel over Israel's mistreatment of Palestinians. Rooney said she would be very pleased and proud to have her book translated into Hebrew, just not by an Israeli company. But again, that didn't stop people from calling her anti-Semitic or from attacking her for standing with the boycott, divestment and sanctions or BDS movement. The press called her decision not to work with an Israeli company controversial. How is it controversial? It's not controversial. The BDS movement is not controversial either. Israel's crimes are controversial. Bombing Syria virtually every week, beating Palestinians and killing them in broad daylight, that's controversial. Do you see how they try and change the subject? That's the whole strategy these days. Anyone who voices criticism of Israeli crimes and Zionism is labeled controversial or racist or anti-Semitic. And having successfully used this tactic in British politics to smear Jeremy Corbyn and drive him out the Labour Party, the Israeli lobby thought, why not try this tactic in British academia, since it's worked so well in British politics? The Israelis have become emboldened. They feel that if they can get British politicians fired for speaking against Israel, then they can do the same with British professors. And now they have, with David Miller. This interference in politics and academia by a foreign power is not just an attack on people who stand in solidarity with Palestinians, it is an attack on British sovereignty itself. Because what Israel is doing here is essentially choosing who is allowed to participate in politics in the United Kingdom and who is allowed to teach in the United Kingdom. Could you imagine a professor being fired from a British university for criticizing Saudi Arabia? You would have people in the UK screaming about Sharia law and how Muslims are taking over Europe. Anyone who cares about the United Kingdom being a sovereign country should be outraged at the shameless meddling of pro-Israel groups in Britain. People would never tolerate this behavior from anyone else. Why should they from Israel? Professor Miller, if you had made the exact same comments about Saudi Arabia or Colombia, do you think you would have been fired?
No, of course not. And what's the reason for that? Well, the reason for that is, of course, the historical pool that there is in our culture, still, and for partly for good reasons, because of the Shoah, because of the deaths in the Holocaust of 6 million Jews, and let's not forget the other millions and millions of victims of the Nazis. That's part of it, but partly also it's to do with the ability of the Zionist movement to activate politics in the UK and in the US and in other countries in a way which the pro-Colombian lobby or the pro-Saudi lobby doesn't have. Interestingly, you use the Saudi lobby as a kind of contrast, and it is a contrast, but the UAE, the Saudis and the Israelis are all on the same page, really, in terms of their attempt to influence this country. But no, of course, I can say what I want about the Saudis or the UAE or the Colombians. And of course, I could have said what I wanted about the apartheid regime. The apartheid regime invested millions and millions of pounds, dollars, rand in trying to influence politics in this country. They had covert operations, they had front groups, and just in the way that the Israel lobby has today. But the difference, of course, is that the Israel lobby is a much larger organization. It's a transnational organization. They much better organized and much better funded lobby than you would see in the case of the Colombians or indeed the Saudis.
Just like someone being fired for criticizing Saudi Arabia or Colombia should be outrageous, so should being fired for criticizing Israel. I don't think that Israel or any foreign power should be deciding who gets to teach at British universities and who gets to run in British politics. And this notion that criticizing Israel is anti-Semitism only works in the West, because in Europe, Europeans have a long history of anti-Semitism. But criticizing Israel and defending Palestinians is not it. When Israeli lobby groups say that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, first of all, who said that all Jews are Israelis and Zionists? There are Jews in Europe, in Syria, in Palestine, in Iran. Not all of them are Zionists or Israelis. You have non-Zionist Jews, just like you have non-Jewish Zionists. Look at Keir Starmer or Joe Biden.
When I was a young senator, I say, if I were a Jew, I'd be a Zionist. I am a Zionist. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist.
Zionism is a political ideology that's barely 100 years old. The Jewish people, the Jewish faith, these are thousands of years old. So anti-Zionism, challenging the political ideology of Zionism, is not anti-Semitism. Not to mention that Palestinians and all Arabs are Semites themselves. They are a Semitic people who speak a Semitic language. Virtually everyone from the Middle East is a Semite, myself included. So how is defending Palestinians, a Semitic people, being anti-Semitic? Listen, let us be under no illusions here. Anti-Semitism is a real problem. Racism exists everywhere. Do you have critics of Israel who also happen to be anti-Semitic? Absolutely. But does that mean everyone who stands up for Palestinians is an anti-Semite? Absolutely not. This is an attempt to silence criticism of Israeli crimes, settler colonialism, apartheid, illegal occupation, dispossession of land, war crimes, nuclear terrorism. These are very specific crimes and have nothing to do with one's religion or race. So this idea that it's about racism and hatred of Jews and anti-Semitism is simply not true. It's about a political ideology. It's about settler colonialism. Anything else is an attempt by Israel to whitewash its crimes and silence its detractors, because it knows that when confronted with the truth regarding its ideology, its beliefs, and its crimes, there is simply no way to win the debate. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Richard Medhurst, and this is The Communique.